Thank you, everyone, and for joining our Trade Justice Alliance Sunday webinar. Tonight's topic is going to be Trumpism and the New Global Economy. We will be welcoming our special guest speaker tonight, William I. Robinson. He's the author. He is an author, and he is a professor at the University of California in Santa Barbara. And this pretty slide you're looking at right now shows a number of his books. We also welcome one of our most well-informed speaker on labor rights, Celeste with the AFL-CIO, and Rose Espinola. She's the National Field Director with Public Citizens Global Trade Watch. A couple of things I'm just going to go over really quickly. For those of you who are in phone only, you may find that our presentation by going to our Facebook group at Trade Justice Alliance. And if you log into the meeting room, you can go to tradejustice.net/room if you want to log into the meeting room. That is, if you're capable. Regarding the chat box here, we only ask that you be respectful of our wonderful guest speakers. My name is Harriet Haywood, and I'll be your moderator this evening, and the meeting room is courtesy of Andrea Miller. She is the Executive Director of People Demanding Action. We wanted to let you know that you can now opt in to receive a text reminder a couple hours before these webinars by texting webinar reminder to 917-791-1131. Also, please stick with us for a special in-district update segment right after Hughes News, and that's when we'll be hearing from our amazing in-district activists like you. So please stick with us for that segment. Now I'm going to introduce our guest speaker. William I. Robinson is a professor of sociology, global and Latin American studies at the University of California at Santa Barbara. He is the author of Global Capitalism and the Crisis of Humanity, published 2014, Latin Intervention and Hegemony in 1996, among other award-winning books. Prior to entering academia, William worked as an investigative journalist in Central America and has lectured at universities around the world on the topics of the global economy, international politics, and contemporary world affairs. He is active in several social justice movements, including immigrant rights in the United States and justice for Palestine. He holds a PhD in sociology from the University of New Mexico. Welcome, William.
Good evening to everyone, and thank you to the Trade Justice Alliance and to Harriet Haywood for setting this up and for inviting me. We're getting a little started later, so I'm just going to jump into this. And I want to start off by saying that there's, I think, a lot of misperception in the media and the public discourse with regard to the renegotiation of the NAFTA and in general with regard to U.S. foreign and trade policy under Trumpism. And I think the best way to look at trade policy and specifically at the renegotiation of the NAFTA is to place it in the context of the transformations that have been underway in the last couple of decades in the U.S. and especially and particularly in the global economy, certainly since NAFTA went into effect in 1994. We have to remember that we can't understand the North American Free Trade Agreement and the North American Economic Region outside of the larger globally integrated production and financial system of which it forms a part. The global economy is characterized right now by vast chains of subcontracting and outsourcing. These chains span every single continent, perhaps with the one single exception of North Korea. There's no country and no region that remains outside of this globally integrated production, financial, and service system and outside of these chains of subcontracting and of outsourcing. So I'm going to suggest that the way we understand, and I'm going to talk more generally and then hone in on NAFTA and Trumpism. But the way we want to understand free trade agreements over the last 20, 30 years and more and neoliberalism is that the agreements and the neoliberal policies serve to open up and serve as to facilitate the integration of all countries and regions into this globally integrated economy. It breaks down state controls over the trans-border movement of capital and state regulations in each country's national economy. So it's the free trade agreements and neoliberal policies that allow corporations to go global, allow corporations to fragment their production processes, their financial processes, and now their service processes across numerous different countries and look for the best conditions. These conditions being, of course, the cheapest labor, the proximity to local market, the best regulatory environment, meaning no regulations, no environmental regulations, no labor regulations, and so forth and so on. I think it's important to identify two different actors, and one would be states, and I'm going to talk about obviously Trump and the Mexican state shortly, but we want to identify the key agent behind capitalist globalization, and that's what I call the transnational capitalist class. The principal capital groups used to be nationally organized, and so you had competition between U.S. capitalists and British capitalists and German capitalists, Japanese capitalists, and so forth. But the principal capitalist groups have long since, over the last 30 or more years, gone transnational, integrated transnationally, and constitute what I now refer to as a transnational capitalist class. And this transnational capitalist class doesn't have any interest in any one particular country. It's very important to understand this because specific governments have interest in their own countries, for which I'll address shortly, and that generates contradictions between governments and transnational corporations. But we want to identify the transnational capitalist class. That includes the leading Mexican capitalist groups, the leading Canadian and U.S. capitalist groups, and they are all united around the North American Free Trade Agreement, generally around the World Trade Organization, and around global integration and capitalist globalization. We can move on to the next slide now.
Okay.
So even if U.S. economic and political elites wanted to dismantle this globally integrated production, financial, and service system, it could not. They could not do so without destabilizing and disrupting the U.S. economy, the North American economy, and the whole global economy. You can't move backwards, just like we can't move backwards from the 20th to the 17th century. And that's not the motive of U.S. economic and political elites. We want to remember specifically when talking about Trump and his cabinet and the key policymakers in his administration that they themselves are members of the transnational capitalist class. Trump has massive investments in all 5 continents around the world, and particularly I want to emphasize in Mexico and in China. I mention those 2 countries because you hear Trump constantly condemning Mexico and China for undermining U.S. economic interests, but the Trump family has vast investments in Mexico and in China, and and so does the rest of his cabinet. There's a very important point to be made here, analytical point, and by the way, I think it's really critical to distinguish public discourse from underlying essence. So we want to be able to analyze Trump's public discourse, but we want to analyze also the underlying essence of what's going on in the U.S. and global economy and society and in the Trump administration. So it's critical to understand that when the United States says Mexico is importing into the United States and undermining U.S. Economic interests, or China is doing that, we're not really talking about Mexican exports to the United States or Chinese exports to the United States. What is produced in Mexico is produced by hundreds of transnational corporations, including U.S. corporations, Chinese, German, Canadian, and Mexican corporations. And then these transnational corporate products are exported from one country to another or back into the United States. Global corporations from all over the world, including the United States, produce goods in China and then export those goods to the United States. So these are not Chinese exports to the U.S. They are not Mexican exports to the U.S. They are transnational capitalist exports or transnational corporate exports from one country to another. So it is important to look at national trade statistics. And so the U.S. has a trade deficit with Mexico and with China. But looking at those trade statistics out of the larger context which I am putting forward to you conceals, rather than elucidates, conceals the transnational essence of the new global economy and confuses what is going on politically. So I mentioned previously that there is a contradiction between some of the interests of nation states or of governments and of transnational corporations. But I'm going to come back to that in a little more detail shortly in the next couple of slides. But first I want to point out that Trump's rhetoric is populist and nationalist and protectionist. But just as you would not judge me if I said to you, I'm a wonderful person and I do great things in the world, you would not judge me on the basis of what I just said. You would judge me on the basis of what I actually did in the world. So we need to evaluate Trump's program, in this case economic program and trade program, not on the basis of Trump's rhetoric, but on the basis of the actual policies it is seeking to implement. And those policies are what I call neoliberalism and capitalist globalization on steroids. Trumponomics involves deregulation, the virtual smashing of the regulatory state, accelerated slashing of social spending. Of course, that's been going on for several decades, but it's now being accelerated. The dismantling of what remains of the welfare state, accelerated privatizations now of infrastructure and of public lands, tax breaks, as we all know, to corporations and the rich, and also an expansion of state subsidies to capital. So there's absolutely nothing populist and nothing particularly nationalist in anything that the Trump administration has done to date. And this is why we need to move beyond the public discourse and go to an analytical focus to get to the underlying essence of Trumpism. And that will bring us to the next slide.
Okay.
Thanks. So we want to remember that the only thing permanent in the universe is change itself. And so NAFTA was, I'm saying that because NAFTA was negotiated in the early 1990s, went into effect in 1994. But since then, the global economy has tremendously been transformed. When NAFTA went into effect in 1994, the largest companies in the United States were automotive companies, appliance companies, machine tools companies, and manufacturing still dominated the U.S. economy. We also want to remember that in 1994, when NAFTA went into effect, the World Trade Organization didn't even exist. It came into being in 1995 and 1996. Very few people used the Internet. We were just transitioning into the age of the digital age. And there was really no such thing as the digital economy. In the early and mid-1990s then, the principal objective of free trade negotiations, and this includes NAFTA, but they were going on all over the world, this was just getting started, was to lift national barriers to the establishment of a globalized system of production, that is, a globalized manufacturing system. And that happened. You're all familiar with the images of the maquiladoras, the sweatshops worldwide, and so forth and so on. That came into being in the late 20th century, and the NAFTA and other trade agreements at that time created the conditions that allowed that globally integrated manufacturing system to get off the ground. It is still in existence, of course, but we want, and by the way, 400, it's not just NAFTA, 400 trade agreements were negotiated around the world from the time that NAFTA went into effect in 1994 until 2016. But here's the key point with what's going on now under Trumpism. Since NAFTA and the World Trade Organization went into effect, the global economy has continued to experience development and transformation, and the key new developments over the last few years has been the transnationalization of services and the rise of what we're now calling the digital or the data economy. This includes communications, informatics, digital and platform technology, e-commerce, financial services, professional and technical work, and a host of other non-tangible products such as music and film, which would require, from the viewpoint of corporations, intellectual property rights. This is now these activities are now at the very core of the global capitalist agenda. And a remarkable piece of data is that in 2017, that's this current year, services account for 70% of total gross world product. So services, and particularly the digital dimensions of these services, are at the very core of the new global agenda, including the trade agenda. Now, here's the other crucial point, linking this specifically to the United States. The U.S. does have a trade deficit with Mexico, but please remember that trade deficit doesn't mean that Mexican companies export more to U.S. than U.S. companies export to Mexico. It means that transnational corporations produce goods in Mexico and export them disproportionately to the U.S. We need to remember that. They're transnational capitalist exports. But having said that, the U.S. does have a deficit of $750 billion in trade with Mexico in 2016. With the rest of the world in 2016. But it ran a $250 billion surplus in trade in services, and particularly the digital services that I already mentioned. This is the same for China as well. So on the one hand, then, the United States is leading the way in this new transnational service and digital phase of global capitalism. And on the other hand, the U.S. has this deficit in non-service trade worldwide. Now, that's one. The other thing going on is that also Mexico and every country in the world, its service sector and its digital sector is dramatically expanding. So Mexican IT services surpassed $20 billion last year. That's a 15% increase, and it's expected to increase 15 to 20% every year as we go into the future. Mexico now has two Silicon Valleys, one in Mexico City and the other in Guadalajara. So both countries, and along with the rest of the world, are moving into the new digitalized global economy. Now, here is where NAFTA and its renegotiation enters the picture. NAFTA did not include provisions related to digital trade. It didn't exist back then, as I was mentioning. In 1994, that we barely had the internet and we didn't have the digital economy. So NAFTA is very, very outdated, seen from the vantage point of transnational capital and the new stage of the global economy. This is why U.S. trade representatives have not said that they want to do away with NAFTA. Trump has said that for reasons which I'll get into. We're in the slide number 3. When we do get into slide 4, I will suggest to you why Trump has this rhetoric of doing away with NAFTA and Mexico is exporting criminals and rapists and so forth. We'll get back to that. But apart from that, U.S. trade representatives are not talking about throwing out NAFTA. The Robert Lighthizer was very clear that the purpose of the renegotiations is to update NAFTA, to modernize NAFTA, and very specifically he has stated that, and let me actually quote him, NAFTA was negotiated 25 years ago, he said, and while our economy and businesses have changed considerably over that period, NAFTA has not. He then went on in these statements, this is statements made as the NAFTA renegotiations were opening up a few months ago, to say that the renegotiation will focus on digital trade, on intellectual property rights, and also on state-owned enterprises. That last point is that Mexico still has a number of state-owned enterprises, and transnational corporate capital is salivating because they want to get their hands on those enterprises. They want everything privatized. So we need to understand that the renegotiation of NAFTA is aimed, 1, at updating NAFTA to include the new digital trade, secondly, at further opening Mexico to transnational corporate plunder, and that includes Mexican transnational capitalists who want to plunder their own working classes and resources. And third, this is critical to see that even though the Trump administration jettisoned the TPP, what it's doing in the renegotiation is basically cutting and pasting major elements of the TPP that have to do with the trade and services, and also taking major portions of TISA, Trade and Services Agreement, taking those two, cutting and pasting them, and putting them into the NAFTA renegotiations. So everything here does not point to a withdrawal of the U.S. from the global economy. It does not point to protectionism, economic nationalism, and populism. It points to the United States leading the way in this new phase of capitalist globalization and forcing capitalist globalization in this new phase on the rest of the world, including in this case on Mexico and on Canada. And that's exactly what the United States has done over the last 30, 40 years. It's the most powerful state in the world, and it has used that power to push capitalist globalization and force it on the peoples of the world. So that's exactly what we're seeing. Let us, I believe I'm ready now. Let me see. We can move on to the final slide. And how are we doing on time?
You can finish your presentation. So
okay,
just go ahead.
So there's a big enigma here. Right? We want to ask, if I'm arguing all of these things, that the U.S. under Trumpism, just as before Trumpism, there's a continuity here, is pushing the new stage of capitalist globalization, focusing on digitalization and so forth and so on. If I'm arguing that, then how do we explain the nationalist, populist, and protectionist rhetoric? And by the way, in parentheses, NAFTA may collapse. I doubt it will. I'm predicting it will not. But even if it does, that won't mean that there's a withdrawal back to national economies and back to U.S. economic nationalism and protectionism. We have to remember that the World Trade Organization, I know the Trade Justice Alliance also is quite familiar with more generally with the World Trade Organization. Let's remember that the Doha round collapsed, and it's never been resuscitated. And that collapsed at the beginning of the century. And yet, for the last 15 years, capitalist globalization has deepened, and numerous bi- and multilateral trade agreements have been signed. So even if NAFTA does collapse, which certainly is a possibility, we cannot rule that out, it does not mean a withdrawal from capitalist globalization. It means it will just take a different institutional form in the North American region. So then let me identify now what I consider global capitalism is in deep crisis. We don't have time to go into all the dimensions of that crisis, but what I want to emphasize here is what I refer to as the crisis of state legitimacy. And what I mean by this is that each state or each government has to promote transnational accumulation, transnational economic activities in their own territories, create jobs, create local prosperity and wealth. That's what governments are supposed to do, and that's where they get the legitimacy. And so they have to do that. On the other hand, governments need political legitimacy at home, and that comes from the well-being of a particular population. So this will sound a bit academic, and then I'll break it down. There is a contradiction between the legitimacy function of states, including the U.S. government or the U.S. state, and the accumulation function of states, including the U.S. state. All over the world, governments are facing crises of legitimacy because they need to integrate their countries into the global capitalist system. They're dependent on transnational investment, on transnational capital. And on the other hand, they have to do what's best for their populations. And what is worse, what creates unemployment, what creates social polarization, what creates downward living standards and instability for masses of people is precisely capitalist globalization. So that's why I said at the beginning of the presentation, the only thing permanent in the universe is change itself, and the only other thing is permanent in the universe is that everything is contradictory. So we are identifying a contradiction here. It should not come as any surprise. Capitalist globalization is a deeply crisis-ridden and contradictory process. But what this means is that Trumpism needs to establish a social base in the United States, and we know that that social base is downwardly mobile, predominantly white sectors of the U.S. working class. Historically, we spoke about a labor aristocracy, meaning that when the U.S. and Western Europe became colonial powers and imperialist powers, they were able to plunder the former Third World, Latin America, Africa, and Asia, transfer that wealth back to their own countries, and redistribute it downward so that the working classes in Europe, Japan, and the United States in this case, saw rising standards of living. In the United States, that was very racialized. It was predominantly white workers that in the latter part, second half of the 20th century, had these rising standards of living. But with capitalist globalization, the U.S. working class is no longer a labor aristocracy. It's experiencing downward mobility, economic destabilization, increasing insecurity, and uncertainty. This is a theme that everyone is well aware of. And so the U.S. state has to somehow prevent that predominantly white sector of the working class from rebelling against the system. And this is where a racist mobilization of Trump's social base comes into play. So either this downwardly mobile sectors of the U.S. working class can align with other sectors of the working class, can align internationally, or they can identify with the Trump regime. And in this case, the political brilliance of the Trump regime, seen from its own interests, has been to mobilize through a racist, deeply racist discourse, a misogynist discourse, but also an imperialist discourse, has been able to mobilize this sector of the U.S. Working class. And that is where the attacks, the rhetorical attacks against Mexico and China come in. And also that is where the war against immigrants in the United States comes in. So I want to say and of course scapegoating. This is a tried and true mechanism, scapegoating particular sectors of the population in times of crisis. But I want to point out one final thing here as I move on to my, actually two final things as I move on to my conclusion, that we cannot separate, therefore, Trump's Mexico agenda, its agenda of renegotiating NAFTA and its rhetoric against Mexico, its deeply imperialist and racist and chauvinist rhetoric against Mexico, from the war against immigrants inside the United States. They are two sides of the exact same coin. And in the question and answer, we can go into more detail. I fear that I'm just about out of time on that point, but we need to link these two. The other thing I want to point out here is that there's really no material basis for a payoff to Trump's social base. What I mean by that is that Trump is appealing to several tens of millions of predominantly white U.S. workers and saying your problems are not capitalist globalization, your problems are not this system that we transnational capitalist class benefit from and push and impose on the world. Your problems are Mexicans and immigrants and China and so forth. But in exchange for this, there's no actual material basis. There's no way that no matter what the Trump regime does, it's not going to be able to bring high-paying jobs back. It's not going to be able to reverse the downward mobility of these sectors of the U.S. working class. It's not going to be able to restabilize and bring security back to the majority of U.S. workers. So that contradiction is going to deepen. We're in for a period of mass conflict and upheaval and uncertainty, as you all know. But so just to conclude then, in sum, this is a moment of crisis, a moment of contradiction, and the more we have analytical clarity, the better we're able to understand U.S. economic policy, trade policy, and the renegotiation of NAFTA. Looking at my clock, and that's just about a half hour.
That's beautiful. I can't believe you actually ended on time. Thank you. Okay, well, what we're going to do now, that was a wonderful presentation, kind of leaves me speechless, and but I'm hoping other people won't be speechless. So we're going to open the lines up now for Q&A. So if you have a question for William, press *6, and then it'll ask you to push 1 on your phone right now. And then we'll put you in the queue.
We do have one question ready to go if you're ready.
I am.
Okay. Mary, your line is open.
Hi. What about investor-state dispute settlement provisions? I had heard that they might get phased out in the NAFTA renegotiation, and I was hoping that was a hopeful sign. But I'd like to hear your thoughts about that.
Yes, I've been following that, and I'm not fully clear on that because I just read an article on. I just read several articles on the most recent round of renegotiation that took place this weekend, and new statements by the Trump government. But I think part of that story is that the objective of the United States is to not let any state interfere in the prerogatives of capital and of corporations. there's a contradiction here, of course, because a corporation in Mexico can challenge the Mexican state, and the U.S. is trying to phase this out. In other words, the investor-state dispute mechanism has operated so far in the interests of corporations and not in the interests of states. But that is one element that that confuses me, because it's otherwise has been at the center of the whole trade regime that's come about in the last 30 years around the World Trade Organization and capitalist globalization. I also want to, while you've asked that question, because I came across that again when I'm reading what just took place this weekend, it just ended this afternoon in Washington with the latest round of renegotiation. The other thing that went on is that the Trump team said that it did not want Google or Facebook or Comcast or the giant digital companies to be able to be sued or sanctioned because music and copyright material is published. So what that tells us is that there's a conflict between the giant digital companies and other factions of capital around these negotiations. The reason I'm bringing that up is because it means there's going to be these conflicts internal to what we can call the transnational capitalist class, and they're going to create these different contradictions, such as differences over investor-state dispute mechanisms. I hope that's helpful.
It's very complex, but yes, I'll sit with that. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Our next caller comes from area code 870. Your line is open.
Thank you, and thank you for taking my call. I just had a question about what you're calling transnational capitalism. Is it too strong to word that transnational fascism? Because that's what I believe it is.
I've been doing a lot of writing and a lot of speaking about what I refer to as 21st century fascism. And absolutely, we have to remember that fascism, whether it's in the 20th or the 21st century, has always been a response to the crisis of capitalism, a far-right response to that crisis. And so we are absolutely seeing right now the rise of 21st century fascist projects in response to the crisis of global capitalism. And inside the United States, that is absolutely a part of the story of Trumpism. I don't think we live in a fascism yet in the United States. We want to make a little analytical distinction between far-right authoritarianism and the move towards fascism. We're not there, and hopefully we can beat it back. But absolutely, global capitalism has been moving into a deeper crisis, and as it moves more deeply into that crisis, far-right elements mobilize a fascist base as a response to the crisis. That's sort of what I was getting at. Part of Trumpism is to mobilize that downwardly mobile sector of the U.S. working class, and part of that mobilization involves a dramatic mobilization of outrightly fascist forces in U.S. society. We're seeing that. We're also seeing it in Europe. We're seeing it in Turkey. We're seeing it in Israel. We're seeing it in the Philippines. So absolutely, the danger of 21st century fascism is very, very real as this system of global capitalism moves into deeper crisis.
Thank you for your response. I appreciate that.
Thank you. Okay, our next question comes from caller at area code 704. Your line is open. Hello, caller at area code 704. Do you have a question?
Oh, yeah. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Okay. So anyways, say 25 years ago, we have a company in Newport Beach, California. We actually hire people from Mexico. They actually go to the University of Mexico, and they speak a few different languages. They come over here. They work here. We know some of their families. So, we like to hire them. But they actually, in Mexico, say 20, 25 years ago, they worked for an Italian company that they were building stuff for Italy and shipping it over to the United States. So this what you're talking about seems to have been going on for a very long time. Okay, the problem, Trump just came into the picture. The issues that we are having right now really, to me, don't have anything to do with Trump. But the issue that we are having right now, what are we going to do about it? Because we need to get together, and we need to have a strong response to what the government is doing to the American people. So that's my question.
Right. Well, two things. One is that the issues going on now don't have anything to do with Trump. Well, I think in one sense you're absolutely right, and that's what was trying to emphasize in the presentation, that we need to look historically, we need to have a deeply historical analysis. We used to have a world of national economies that traded their own national products. That world came to an end starting in the 1970s. So we're now in the fourth decade of capitalist globalization, and absolutely Trumpism, which we've only had 1 year of, is only the latest development in this 4-decade-old situation. So absolutely, you are right about that. And again, I emphasize the need to take an historical perspective in our analysis. I'll just make another comment with regard to Mexican workers being brought into Southern California or working for Italian companies that set up shop in Mexico. What we have seen is the creation of a global labor market. We used to have national labor markets, but now we have a ever more integrated, globally integrated labor market. What I mean by that is that transnational corporations can and do move workers all around the world. Low-paid, undocumented workers move all around the world, and transnational corporations want that. They need that. They're able to super exploit and super control undocumented workers wherever they might be, in Europe, wherever, in the United States, of course. But they're also able increasingly to move or set up the conditions in order to move skilled workers all around the world, wherever skilled workers are needed. So workers continue to identify with their own nation states, and if you're looking for solutions, I think part of the solution is for us to overcome this national consciousness and start developing as working classes of every country and transnational class consciousness. You know, one of the things that the Trump government is doing with its immigration policy is cracking down on undocumented poor immigrants, but not in order to do away with them. The U.S. economy can't do away with these undocumented immigrants, rather to create conditions which will allow for their total control and super exploitation even more than currently. But the other thing about Trump immigration policy is that it's setting up a new visa program where it will be much more easier for global corporations operating inside the United States to import from anywhere around the world skilled workers. And when I say global corporations, there's another misunderstanding, that if you're a corporation in Southern California, you are a U.S. corporation. But that's not true. There's thousands of corporations from every corner of the world, including Mexican corporations inside U.S. territory. And they are able to take advantage of transnational, undocumented, poorly paid, super-controlled immigrant labor. And they're also going to be able to take advantage of the new visa programs the Trump government is putting into practice, which will allow them to import skilled labor from anywhere around the world. So, I mean, all of this points to the need to move beyond what I call a nation-state framework of analysis for understanding the world in the year 2017. We need to have a new transnational perspective. And I hope I'm, contributing to us thinking about that in this discussion.
Absolutely, that is so important. I don't see anybody else in the queue right now.
Harriet,
yeah.
Yeah, one more question, if you don't mind, from Adam.
Oh no, I don't mind at all. Yeah.
How about it? Okay,
I was going to
Adam,
try to get one. Go ahead, Adam.
Thanks. So I was just wondering. If we accept the premise that Trump's picking up this populist rhetoric, right populist rhetoric, is more than is just sort of a strategy to build and hoodwink a base, I'm just wondering how we account for the fact that he's been using this sort of rhetoric on trade, this sort of old right paleocon rooted rhetoric on trade since years before he was seriously considering a presidential run. He railed against Chorus when it was still in question what was going to happen with it. I mean, he has made critical statements critical of neoliberal trade policy back to the 80s. I'm just wondering what his agenda there was.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question, and I'm going to answer it in a broader way than you might want me to, but I think I need to do that. And that is that in the larger scheme of things, our world and our universal history, the individual is not important. What is important are the big social forces and big historical processes at work and collectives. But in the immediate day-to-day analyses, such as what Trumpism is doing today and its renegotiation in NAFTA as took place in Washington this past weekend, the individual level of analysis does become important. And I'm bringing it up because the analysis of Trump as an individual, because you're targeting him, in your question, which is correct to do so. But at that individual level, individuals sometimes play significant roles in history. Trump himself, and I'm not saying anything new here or anything I think anyone would disagree with, is extremely unstable. He's not very sharp intellectually. He doesn't, he can't even speak well, and so forth and so on. So, I mean, his comments, his bombastic comments over the last 20, 30 years are only relevant insofar as he now became president. And as president, by the way, his power is quite limited. That's another thing, and I realize we're just about out of time, but when we study the actual workings of power, sure, he can influence certain things, but he as the individual is much less important than what he can actually do within the constraints of a cabinet, of real power exercised by corporate capital, the rest of the political class, and the economic elite, and the condition of the whole global capitalist system. So, yes, his rhetoric is significant. I cannot explain why over the last 30 years he's railed against globalization, even as he has set up a global empire, which I mentioned previously in Mexico, China, and in every single continent. But the only thing that's relevant to point out now is that as an individual or even as an administration, he and they do need to maintain a social base. They'll lose legitimacy. They'll be overthrown. If you only have 5-10% supported population, you're overthrown. That's conditions for revolution. So it does mean that there's this contradiction that the administration faces. How do you please at least a minimal social base so that you're not overthrown? And on the other hand, how do you push forward this agenda in your own class and elite interests of capitalist globalization? So it's a complex analysis, and I would just conclude by saying Trump's individual personality and his comments over the last 30, 40 years then are important, but they're not really the key thing that I think we need to focus on to get the big answers, ask the big questions, and get the big answers.
Thank you.
Great. That was a good question and answer, Adam and William. I had one really quick question. I'm sure we all want to know if one of your books addresses possibly the way that people can perhaps create these transnational cross-border networks in order to, change the consciousness of people in this country towards one of transnational worker solidarity.
Right. Okay. Well, specifically with my books, they all mention that briefly at the end, and I'm coming out with a new book in 2018 with Haymarket, which is a collection of essays in which I'm trying to make more accessible beyond the academy my ideas on global capitalism. So I go into a little more detail in that book, which will be titled Into the Tempest, and it will be out next year. However, I've always stressed that the answers to what we do about the crisis of global capitalism and what I call the crisis of humanity won't come from intellectuals such as myself. It will come from masses of people in their day-to-day battles and day-to-day struggles and collectives such as yourselves, you folks, in the Alliance. So my role within that context, I have my own ideas on how we need to transnationalize our struggles, but my specific role is more limited to presenting this transnational analysis and the inputs for people in the real world day-to-day struggles to develop strategies. So, I hope that in my conversation with you and in these books, I'm successful at that level. That's all I as an individual can do besides participating in the struggles themselves.
Yes, I'm reading the one book now, Global Capitalism and the Crisis of Humanity. It's excellent. It's an excellent book. I highly recommend it. Thank you so much, William. It was really great to have you, and we hope that you may join us on a future call in between all your university work and travels. It's kind of hard to pin you down. So we're really glad you were able to join us. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much for having me on.
Thank you. You're welcome. Good night. Stick with us if you care to, although you can't see the chat box, unfortunately, but you can listen to our wonderful speakers. Thank you very much. Okay, our next speaker is Celeste Drake. Celeste is a Trade and Globalization Policy Specialist with the AFL-CIO. She works to improve U.S. trade policy so it doesn't send more jobs overseas, and also to improve labor rights for workers overseas so that workers globally can race to the top instead of having global corporations push us to the bottom. Celeste earned a BA, a JD, and an MPP from UCLA. Welcome, Celeste.
Hi, Harriet. Can you hear me okay?
Yep, you sound loud and clear.
Okay, perfect.
Okay.
Hi, everyone. I just want to give a little progress report on the NAFTA renegotiation. So going from the big political analysis that William was just giving you, I'm going to just talk about some of the nitty-gritty that's happening in these talks. They're actually in Mexico City right now doing the talks that are officially over on Tuesday. But you can actually go to your, open a new tab and go to Google right now and just hit NAFTA and search under news rather than the web, and you can see there are already a lot of reports out. So let's start with the next slide, please. So this is basically just a reminder of this is what we're looking for. The AFL-CIO, America's other labor unions, Canadian unions, Mexican unions, we're all looking for a new North American economy. None of us are pleased with NAFTA. I think you just heard this is not, as much as the mainstream media might try to present it that way, or folks may have previously kind of viewed trade, maybe even somehow in the way that Trump talks about it, that it's somehow country versus country and one country profiting at the expense of another. That's not, frankly, how it works in today's global economy. It really is all about putting rules in place that have benefited these global corporations, which would be fine if they were benefiting with working people, but it's not, because it's really benefiting at the expense of working people. And that's really been the problem, and that's been the case for decades. And what these trade agreements like NAFTA do is lock in a set of rules so that there are certain rules that we can't have a fight about anymore. So right now there's a big fight in Congress about what is our tax policy going to be for the future. At least we can have a fight about it, right? It's a hard fight for progressives to win because the Republicans control the House and the Senate and the presidency and the courts, but progressives are making a go of it. In terms of when the rules are in place in a trade agreement, they're in place. And this NAFTA renegotiation, interestingly, is the first time that we've ever had a chance to be involved and say, hey, this is a pretty bad set of rules, let's try and change them. So how's that going? Next slide, please. So there's some mixed bag. And actually, if you look at what's being put on the table, it's not a consistent, thought-through ideology. So, excuse me, I have a little bit of a cough this evening. When you think about Trump and Trumpism, I tend to say when you look at what the people he's put in place are doing, it's not really one consistent worldview. And in my view, that's because Trump really doesn't have one. He'll pontificate as if he has a worldview, but when you look at the actions that he's taking, they don't seem to really fit. And I think Adam Weissman was trying to get at that last question, sort of, well, he's doing some things that seem really old school Republican, and he's doing a lot of stuff for the global corporations, but what about his populist rhetoric? And It is all over the place. So starting with what we call ISDS, investor to state, dispute settlement, or more colloquially, corporate courts. Folks know this is the provision in NAFTA and in subsequent trade agreements that gives the global corporations that have invested in a particular host country the right to say, you have violated my rights under this trade agreement, and it might be an actual taking, it might be a law, regulation, or court decision that they feel is quote-unquote not fair and equitable, diminishes their profits. It might be something that they say is an indirect taking, so it's not in fact a taking, but what this action did was to reduce their expected profits, all of that. The progressive view is get rid of those, eliminate them, totally get rid of them. So what was put on the table by this administration, interestingly enough, wouldn't eliminate them, but it does say, well, countries can actually opt out of the whole process, which would be an elimination for some countries. And the idea here is that the thought would be that the U.S. would opt out and that Mexico would opt in. Well, that's not very helpful. Yes, it might be helpful in that the U.S. wouldn't see challenges, but if our brothers and sisters in Mexico are having their democracy diminished by those challenges, it's not that helpful. And if what you're trying to do is sort of take away the taxpayer subsidy for outsourcing jobs, which is exactly what ISDS is, you haven't really solved that problem. So the more important part of the proposal actually says, even for countries that opt in, the only complaint that a foreign corporation could make would be an actual taking, so a physical taking of the property that didn't come with paying that corporation for taking their property. And since that act is actually unconstitutional in the United States anyway, you've really restricted the number of cases that even countries that opt in could face. You'd get rid of a lot of this essentially rent-seeking, where these corporations go around and have cases just to complain. So it's a pretty good proposal, regardless of how we feel about Trump and all the rest of it. That's a good proposal. Will it make it into the final NAFTA? Well, Mexico and Canada have both said they don't like the proposal. Certainly if you're looking at the reaction of the U.S. corporate class, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, the National Association of Manufacturers, they're a little bit hair on fire with talking about how disastrous it would be, so they're going to fight it. So it's really interesting, and that the only folks that have said this is a good proposal are the folks on the progressive end, the labor movement, the environmental movement, the consumer movement, and none of us are the natural allies of the president. So it's kind of interesting. Next slide, please. So another thing that's been put on the table, folks might have heard a little bit about, or how we phrased it was that we should really change these obligations. They're called procurement obligations. It's essentially government purchasing in trade agreements. And we said not only get rid of the obligation to treat all bidders, regardless of country, in the trade agreement the same, but also add some additional bidding requirements. So make sure that it's okay, that nobody's going to challenge if you have a bidding requirement that says you've got to use recycled materials, or you have to pay a living wage, or you have to provide benefits for spouses of any gender identity, things like that. So they haven't gone that far, but the proposal actually really limits the restrictions on Buy American policies. So in comparison to the existing NAFTA, that's kind of a passing proposal. It's not great. It's not what we asked for, but it's interesting. So next slide, please. And then we're going to have a whole series of these where an important thing that the progressive movement asks for just has not been put on the table at all. So what the grade here I've given them is a 0, because you can't really give them any sort of explanatory grade or letter grade. But the bottom line is those things could be put on the table. But if they're not, it really, again, shows you how all over this place is. You can't say the NAFTA that's been proposed is some sort of new progressive deal, because it's just not. It's very all over the place. So there's no proposal on currency rules. And again, folks who follow trade know that when there aren't rules for currency, countries that choose to can manipulate their currency, misalign their currency, play other games with their currency in order to gain a trade advantage. So it's a big disappointment for those who believed the president's rhetoric that he was going to do something about currency, to see that there's no proposal to do that yet in NAFTA. Next slide, please. So another one that we had asked for in particular in the AFL-CIO's recommendations, and we had 17. We said we should improve the screening mechanisms for foreign domestic investment. And so what that means is when they invest, foreign companies in the United States, we should look at not just whether it's some sort of national security threat, but let's examine how it's going to impact the economy. Is this an investment that is designed to create jobs and long-term jobs? Because if so, that's great, and that's foreign investment that we should welcome. If it's not, if it's designed to sort of capture some valuable intellectual property or capture something valuable and then take that elsewhere and lay people off immediately, well, then perhaps we might want to say maybe we wouldn't like that particular buyer to buy that asset. So there's been nothing proposed there, and that's a disappointment, because if you don't put those rules into the trade agreement and you try and create those rules domestically later, they can be challenged, of course, by those foreign corporations that are looking to invest and strip the assets. So that's not great so far, but again, it could change. Next slide, please. So the next one, and this goes right along with what I was saying before about what's moving through Congress. So our proposal was, hey, we should put rules into the trade agreement that say, look, as we're changing our tariffs and creating all these other rules, we know that there are going to be offshoring of jobs. That's just something that's going to happen. Can we also put in a set of tax rules that offset some of the incentives so that if you're offshoring those jobs, you still pay your fair share of taxes to the home state? If you are giving, which this happens even within the United States, state to state, so folks may be familiar with this, and then think about how it happens internationally. When a locality wants an investment, think about right now all the places that are competing for the new second Amazon headquarters. A lot of what happens there are tax holidays, tax abatements, tax adjustments, other sort of giveaways on taxes to these companies to say, hey, come and invest here. And, in the long run, it could be a positive thing, for a locality to do this. But there's also been some studies, and, quite frankly, it's not always a good thing. You might get the jobs, but if you didn't, in your agreement, tell that company they have to pay jobs at a certain level and they have to provide a certain amount of training, and, oh, by the way, how are they going to get the workers to the new site? Are they just going to create more traffic gridlock? Are they going to contribute to that? That you actually end up with a lose-lose situation, because the place that has gotten the investment not only is not getting any new tax revenue from the business itself, it's also incurring a lot of new expenses. So our proposal to combat tax dodging here said all of these deals have to be public and above board so everybody knows exactly what's happening with these tax deals. And that's a little bit of an incentive not to totally give away the farm, right? Because people are looking over your shoulder and seeing exactly how much you're giving away to these private interests. So at the same time, we don't see the proposal that we want in the NAFTA. We see a really devastating tax bill that actually promotes more international outsourcing of jobs going through the House and Senate. So it's sort of a double whammy. We're not making it better in NAFTA, and we're making our tax policies worse through the tax laws. The next slide, please. And this is really the most important one, and this is why I have it in yellow. No matter what else you do in NAFTA, and we could talk about, right, the environmental rules, and we could talk about the regulatory rules and the financial services rules and the medicines rules, and I've talked about some of those in other times, so that's why I picked a few different ones here. Nothing else matters if we don't get labor rights and wages up in Mexico. And what's been put on the table so far doesn't cut it. It's actually a minuscule step above the TPP labor chapter. So if you want to just measure, is there any progress? There was some, fine. But the labor movement said the TPP labor chapter wasn't going to work. So a minuscule improvement doesn't do it. Now, interestingly enough, because of this sort of strange bedfellows and who supports what in the NAFTA agreement, Robert Lighthizer, who is the USTR, and he doesn't come from this, paleo-conservative background, and he doesn't come from the global corporate background. He's talking to the labor movement. He's talking to other outside stakeholders who are not from the corporate community. He's asking us what we like, what we don't like. He's talking to us. So again, where I have all these comments, these things could change, these grades could change. Is it possible the labor provisions could change and actually be more like what we've been asking for? Maybe. I mean, the door seems to be open. They're having these conversations. One wouldn't predict it if you looked at this administration's Secretary of Labor or Secretary of Education or Secretary of the Treasury. But in terms of this is such a strange thing happening, and are they being consultative? Yes. So we have to say again, the door is open for that grade to go up. And a reason why this is particularly important, I just want to emphasize for folks who don't know, last night, just last Saturday night, death squads from the quote-unquote Labor Federation of CTM, and this is, what we call a fake labor federation, a protection labor federation, they attacked striking workers from the mine workers union, and 5 communities, just the citizens of those communities were striking with the workers in Media Luna in the state of Guerrero in Mexico. 2 of the workers were assassinated. So this is happening in Mexico at the exact same time that in Mexico City, 3 governments are talking about how to fix NAFTA and renegotiate NAFTA. And yet I didn't see, when I was doing my Google search of the NAFTA news, I didn't see the trade reporters talk about the fact that workers are being killed simply for exercising their rights while they're negotiating NAFTA. I didn't see a statement from any of the negotiators expressing any sympathies with the families of the assassinated workers. I mean, it's as if these 2 pieces of news were happening on different planets, but they're not. And this is why it's important. When you have a labor situation where you put your life on the line and you can be killed simply for saying, I am striking for better wages and safer conditions and, hiring people from the community, that means you don't have basic freedoms. And when you don't have basic freedoms, you are abused, you are exploited, you are obviously earning less than you otherwise would earn. And that kind of repression spreads to other employers in your community, other employers in your country, and quite frankly, other employers globally, particularly when you have these trade agreements that bring the economic ties closer together. So that's essentially kind of where we are. One might be able to say, there's some mixed news, but when you look at the news that's really, really, really important, it's not going in the right direction, and folks just need to know that's what we want action on are the labor rights. The next slide, please. So what we're asking folks to do, since the talks wrap up officially on Tuesday, is if you have an opportunity, call your member of Congress's local office and just say, I'm calling to find out what you think about the NAFTA renegotiations. Did you follow it this weekend? Do you have something to say? And urge them, if they can't give an answer, because you'll probably get a staffer who can't give an answer, say, look, it'll just be great if your boss can issue a press release commenting on the talks, and I'll be looking out for that. And anyone who wants to join the AFL-CIO's fight for better trade, you can text TRADE to 235246. The number's there on the screen. You can also follow the AFL-CIO or follow me on Twitter at CDrakeFairTrade. And that's the end of my presentation.
Very good, Celeste. Thank you so much. It's nice to know people like you are standing up for the Mexican people. It's always been the reason why I got involved in this fight to begin with. So if you'll stick with us after Rose, we'll have a combined Q&A.
Yep.
Thank you so much. Rose, are you with us?
I am.
Beautiful. I'm going to introduce you now. Hi. We are working a little behind schedule, but not too terrible. We've done worse. I'd like to introduce Rose Espinola. She is the National Field Director for Public Citizens Global Trade Watch. Rose gets winning. If you know Rose, and as we do, we know that she has been an organizer on successful campaigns ranging from unionization fights to fossil fuel divestment to the TPP campaign and now the NAFTA campaign. So your line is open and you got the mic, Rose.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, Celeste gave a very good update on NAFTA negotiations, and what I want to make sure people know is that we could actually win this. And during and apologies if I repeat myself, I just hopped on a couple minutes ago. If I repeat anything, Celeste, because I just hopped on a couple minutes ago. But the fifth round of negotiations are happening right now in Mexico City, and the sixth round of negotiations are taking place December 11th through 15th in D.C. And when we were fighting against the TPP, and I see some of the names on this call, like Liz King and Bill and Boston, and we have Harriet in Florida, and Dave Anderson, who fought for many years against the TPP in Denver. So a lot of people thought that we weren't going to be able to win, and that it was a lost cause. And back then, we certainly didn't think that we would be able to get these special corporate rights out of TPP. Back then we didn't think we would be able to get these special corporate rights out of trade deals. And with the movement that we've built, it could be a reality, which is incredible. And I think that we have an obligation to fight for a trade deal that could actually be better for poor and working people across North America. And in this past year, we started off with a group of people who had worked on the TPP fight through Trade Justice Alliance, for the AFL-CIO, Public Citizens, all the other groups. And by the summertime, 50,000 comments had been submitted on the U.S. Trade Reps web form asking for comments on NAFTA. And as a result, their web form crashed because we submitted so many comments, and they had to extend comment period by a couple of days. 2 weeks later, we submitted 150,000 petitions and comments at the negotiating round in D.C., and we saw our movement grow and grow. Now there's 450 people in 48 states doing on-the-ground organizing, boots on the ground organizing, getting petitions signed, and we could actually win a better deal. We need to be wary of what Celeste mentioned, the labor protections, and if ultimately this deal isn't something that's better than the current NAFTA, then we would move to a withdraw campaign, because no NAFTA is better than the status quo. And at the same time, we have an obligation to try to get a better deal, to try to win a better deal that would help us undo nearly 24 years of damage caused by NAFTA. So this November, people from all over the country are visiting their congressperson's local district office, and it coincides with the congressional recess, which started last Friday and goes until Monday, November 27th. And it also coincides with the 5th round of NAFTA negotiations, the 24th anniversary of the NAFTA House vote, and Intercontinental Days of Action on Trade. And we are asking people to deliver a couple things. Next slide. So the first step is picking a date and time to drop by your U.S. representative's local office. You can find their office address online, and anytime during the recess, November 17th through 27th works. And any type of in-person visit is very valuable, so you can go on your own, or you can recruit some friends to go with you. And next slide.
Great. Sorry.
No
I was
problem.
trying to do two things at once here. Okay.
So to find out more about how to do an office visit, I know some people on this call are veterans and know exactly what to do. But we also, our friends at Citizens Trade Campaign put together a primer, and you can see it if you go to replacenafta.org/visit. That's replacenafta.org/visit. And there's a couple things to bring. One of them is a template letter, and you should edit it to include your Congress member's name and your contact information. Next slide. So once you're ready to do the visit, you want to be friendly, introduce yourself to the receptionist, and ask if you can speak to the district director for a minute to deliver a letter about NAFTA. Explain that NAFTA has hurt jobs and wages in your state, and give them a state-specific fact sheet. We have them for all 50 states with the impacts of NAFTA on your state. And I think Harriet will be able to send out the link, since you can't click on links on the presentation. And then say that you want the ongoing NAFTA renegotiation to put working people on the planet ahead of corporate profits by prioritizing much stronger labor and environmental standards, eliminating ISDS, and more. And then you're going to hand over that letter you signed. And then wrap up by asking the congressperson, please send you a letter with their position on the issues at stake in NAFTA. If you're comfortable, you could also ask them to speak out publicly in support of our NAFTA demands, or you could schedule a follow-up meeting. I have a cold. So please excuse me as I trip over some of these words. So you can also schedule a follow-up meeting with the district director, or ask to schedule a meeting with a member of Congress. And if possible, have someone take a picture of you speaking to staff or delivering the letter. So you'll let us know how it went after the visit. We're particularly interested in who went with you, if anyone else, and the name and the role of the staff person you met with. Were they the trade legislative assistant, or were they the district director, or did you speak with a member of Congress themselves? What did they say about the Congress member's position, and what was the tone of the overall meeting? And then if you're able to take any photos, please send me a couple of the best ones. And first things first, you can sign up to do a drop-in at replacenafta.org/NOV, like the abbreviation for November. So replacenafta.org/NOV. Next slide. So far, there are, I'm not sure if this is the fullest on the screen in front of us, but there are about 35 cities where actions and drop-ins will be taking place during this congressional recess period. And I think it'd be great if 3 more people could sign up to do a drop-in during this call. So I'm going to be watching for more sign-ups, and I'll let folks know once we get 3 more people signed up.
So go to replacenafta.org/NOV.
That's right. And then there's one other thing I wanted to let you all know about. The next slide. Okay, so our digital director, Jarrell Clay, is putting together a digital volunteer team, and being a digital volunteer is pretty simple. We'll send you content to promote on social media, including new data, graphics, and news articles on globalization and trade, and ask that you post to Facebook. We'll also provide content for Instagram, Reddit, and Twitter. And if you want to join the digital volunteer team, you can go to replacenafta.org/digi, D-I-G-I. That's replacenafta.org/DIGI. And I would love to get 7 more volunteers for the digital team while we're on this call, and I'll let you know how we're doing on that as well. Let's see how many more people just signed up to do a drop-in.
Can you see?
Okay, I'm checking.
You're testing our age here.
So we have 1 more person who signed up to do a drop-in. Can we get 2 more people? Thank you.
Okay, so is there, let's see, do we have another slide after this? Okay, so is that all for your presentation, Rose? Anything else you want to add? Okay, beautiful. All right, everybody, we're going to open the phones. If you have any questions for Celeste or Rose, press *6 and then the 1 on your phones, and we'll get some answers. Whoop, we got a couple of questions. Oh, we got some great, yep.
Here we go. Okay, our first question comes from Mary. Your line is open.
Hi, this is Mary Shesgreen. Thanks for this excellent presentation. I'm wondering, does labor and environmentalists, do they have a seat at the table equal to the corporate so-called advisors? I know that in past negotiations they had corporate advisors, like 600 of them, drafting the text of the TPP, for example, and the labor people and the environmentalists were just kind of token on the side. What are the power relationships like this time around?
Celeste, would you like to answer that question?
Yeah, hi, Mary. That's a great question, and the official advisory committees are basically exactly the same as you just described. There's roughly 600 total advisors. Out of that, there are about 30-ish who are labor, 5 or 10 who are environmentalists, and about the same number, 10 or 15, who represent local governments, academics, other sort of uninterested parties. The vast majority represents individual businesses or trade associations of businesses. That hasn't changed. And in fact, the full non-transparency of the negotiations haven't changed. So certainly even those advisors aren't in the room while it's being negotiated. We don't get to see the official role, and I'm one of these assistants for President Trump, guy who's one of these advisors, so I can talk about my experience. What we get to see is the U.S. proposal when it's in draft form. We can't then share it because it's, national security rules, but we get to see a version of the U.S. draft proposals. We don't get to see what the other countries put on the table, and we don't get to see sort of the working texts when they merge what all the different countries have put on the table, and they have the text that they're working through and figuring out what from the proposals becomes the final text. We don't get to see any of that. So what has changed and what is a little bit different is where I mentioned, for instance, that the USTR, we really said this labor proposal that you have put on the table is not, it's just not going to work. It's not going to get our support. It's not going to get the support of, most of your working families champions in Congress. So they are reaching out and saying, okay, well, let's have another meeting to at least talk about it. So we're not writing the text for them, and we certainly give them proposals for text, and you can see our proposals for the text on our website. If you just Google AFL-CIO NAFTA recommendations, you can see the 50-page version and the shorter 2-page version. So it's quite interesting, and I keep talking about that it's such a dichotomy. When we talked to the Obama USTR, they were condescending. They clearly didn't respect us. It was clearly, have the meeting so they could check the box that they had the meeting with labor. But we were not a partner with them, and our proposals were not taken seriously. In Mr. Lighthizer USTR, the meetings are polite. They're respectful. I don't necessarily have any evidence that they're going to take any more of our advice than the Obama administration did. So I'm not, trying to make any guarantees about that. But the tone of the meetings are quite different, and it's, they certainly are doing everything they can to imply that our advice will be taken seriously and that they do care what we think. Now, I will say that is the case for labor. My allies from the environmental movement, my understanding is not one of them has been invited for a meeting. So that should be of concern, right? Because that's an important issue as well. But if you're talking to labor, that's great. But when you're looking for the whole progressive package of the trade agreement, and if it's not going anywhere on environment, that certainly is going to be a problem. I will say for most environmental groups, their number one issue, though, isn't the environmental chapter. It's ISDS. So that's some progress.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much. Go ahead.
When we go to see our congressperson, should we be expressing our anger at the lack of transparency and the power imbalance?
Certainly, that's very important, because the bottom line is the best way to get a good deal is to bring it out in the open, right? Yeah. To take it away from behind closed doors. So that continues to be an issue, and I would continue to raise it. They have not. Changing the tone of the consultations it's a step forward. It's great, but the transparency is critical, and that's a separate issue, and it's not happening. So that's certainly one thing that if you're interested in, you should definitely talk about.
Great. Thank you.
I think that talking about transparency is good, and you should also try to get your member of Congress on the record about the investor state dispute settlement, ISDS, which allows multinationals to sue the U.S., Mexican, and Canadian governments in these corporate tribunals. And by getting your member on the record now, it will also be helpful for future trade fights.
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay, our next question comes from caller at area code 908. Your line is open.
Hello, this is Wendy Getz up in New Jersey 5, and I did an office visit, and I'm calling to see what the stats were from the freshman letter, as well as how Sherrod Brown's reaching out to all of his Democrats on NAFTA, and he briefed the OWS conference call the other night, and I sent him a brief email asking for his help with my congressman. And I know he did not sign, although we wallpapered his door, we had lots of letters, and we did a drop-in as well. So my two questions are the stats of the freshman letter and how Sherrod Brown is being impactful, helpful, and what the stats there may be. Thank you.
Rose, you want to hop on that one? The freshman letter?
I think Celeste might be able to answer this better than me, but
okay.
I can hop on it if
okay.
Yeah, that's actually a CTC thing. So that's more you than than
All
us.
right. Yeah. The freshman letter is in progress, and Wendy, you should touch base with me offline for more details on its release. Gottheimer continues to be a big problem, and he is one of those members of Congress we are going to need to watch throughout negotiations and then on future trade votes. And I'm really glad that there's this strong base organizing in New Jersey. And I think that the work that Wendy and others are doing is a great example of tactics that can happen around the country, like doing drop-ins, like doing art builds near your member of Congress's office and holding up banners. And they've also been showing up to Gottheimer's Cup of Joe, where he meets with constituents at local diners. And they've been talking to him there. They've also walked up to him at the state fair and pushed him for his position on ISDS. And then I think that we have this question of where the Democratic Party is going, and we have champions like Senator Brown. And I think that it's becoming clear to more and more Democrats that they need to support trade deals that put people on the planet ahead of multinational corporations if they are going to stay relevant in today's political arena.
Great.
Yeah. I'll just add the on the Senate side, Senator Tammy Baldwin out of Wisconsin just led a letter on NAFTA, the labor issues specifically, and got pretty good sign-on. Sherrod Brown didn't sign it, not because he's not supportive of these labor issues, but that was a choice that he made based on his relationship with Lighthizer, where, again, this is a person that Lighthizer has been reaching out to and consulting with, and just felt that message is better sent directly to Lighthizer in their conversations and that. So I wouldn't take his failure to sign on the Baldwin letter as any sign of him not being committed. That's would be the wrong thing to assume. But the main thing is that for folks who are problematic now, if they won't get on a freshman letter, if they won't tell you that they're against ISDS, if they won't put out a press release saying that these are my thoughts about the NAFTA status of the NAFTA renegotiations, that they're signaling they're going to be the problematic person when it comes time to a vote, because this is the easy stuff. And too many Democrats are exactly like Rose said, they don't really know what they stand for, and some of them are being conned into being the defender of NAFTA. It's as if somebody put it to me this way the other day, and I thought it was a great analogy. It's as if NAFTA is in jail and these guys want to bail it out. That's not our job. It's in jail because it's a bad deal, right? And people don't like it because it has had bad impacts. And the Democratic Party, if these are folks that are in competitive seats or there's another wave election or whatever, if they think that the way that they're going to make their constituents trust them is by being the defender of status quo corporate trade. They've got it wrong. This is what helped Trump get elected. In 4 critical states, trade was a critical issue. We don't have time for folks who pretend to be friends of working people and are out there trying to save the status quo. They have to at least begin by speaking up with what is wrong with NAFTA and what they would like to see better. And so that freshman letter is a great place. That's just a starting point. So I'll stop.
Thank you. Okay, we have time for one quick question. Wendy, we still have a section where people can talk a little bit about their events after Hugh gives his short news report, and that'll be very soon. We have one more person in the queue.
Caller at area code 704, your line is open.
Okay. The problem that I see is that...
What's your name? I'm sorry.
Okay, my name's Frank. Okay, and the
Frank.
problem that I see is that, I've been an activist for quite some time, and that our representatives do not represent us. They represent the 1%. Mm-hmm. So, you can read a book. It's called The People's History of the United States. Oh, A People's History of the United States. And you read that book, and it more or less will run down, the United States history and our government, the way that it's interacted with the population through the years. And they have always represented the 1%. So in order for us to get them, these people to represent us, we have to do something, really big. Going to our representatives and telling them something, 1 or 2 people or even 100 or 1,000 people is not going to do much of anything. I just like to say this. During the Iraq attack, when they were talking about the attack of the mushroom cloud, that they were going to blow us up, that they were making uranium. And then when you looked at the aluminum tubes, since the company that I work for, we work with material like that, we seen that it was impossible to machine the aluminum tube that he had into centrifuge tubes. And we called up a few representatives. One of them was the Rockefeller, the guy from West Virginia. He was the head guy in charge of investigating some stuff about this. We gave him the information. They didn't do nothing about it. We gave it to a few of our representatives, our state senators and stuff. They'd done nothing about it. We spoke about it on the radio. Nothing happened. Okay, well, people later on found out that those tubes and the mushroom cloud and the uranium, that all this stuff was made up. But the 1% wanted that Iraqi oil, and they were going to do anything that they had to get it, including murdering a bunch of people and children, and they done it. So if you want NAFTA if you want that to change for the better of America, you have to come up with a good idea on how to change it, and you have to be able to put that out there.
We all have. That's all of our responsibility.
That is.
We were successful in stopping the TPP, and that is because a lot of people work together, and that's what we all have to do. It's a collective effort to win. It's not one. We're always going to be fighting these wars.
Okay, see, but the thing is, I buy my shoes from Italy. I buy them from a few other countries over there. And the thing is that we don't know what the PTT, the Trans-Pacific Partnership was about, the whole thing. We didn't know how it was going to affect America any different than any other trades that we have with other countries right now. Yeah. We don't know the exact thing. What we do know is that the lawyers were going to benefit it, where the corporations were going to make more money. But as far as workers were concerned, We didn't know that because we already trade with everyone. Like I say, I buy my shoes. They're $300 a pair at least from Italy. They don't make good shoes in the United States or China. Sorry about that. So, you know, and so people are going to buy their stuff, and they have been buying their stuff from where they want to buy it. So we don't know how any of these are really going to affect us. And when you look at NAFTA really hurt the farmers that came over here and worked. You know, so and a lot of them are still over here doing other jobs.
You know what? So, why don't you stick with us? We unfortunately we're working on a time at the end. We have an open conversation, so stick with us. We have these guest speakers, and we are on a time schedule. But we appreciate your what you have to say. So thank you very much, and let's move on to the news now and open the mic for Hugh. Thank you, Rose and Celeste. We'll be talking to you again.
Thank you for your excellent work.
Thank you. I'd now like to introduce Hugh Campbell. He's a CPA and a financial professional. His activism focuses on economic justice and voting rights issues. And I just wanted to mention that he just recently traveled to Virginia from New York to help get out the vote and in that state. He's a member of our Trade Justice Alliance and has participated with us since the early days. And he's also a member of the Coalition for Prosperous America, the Network Lobby, and Public Citizen. He's a regular contributor also on the U.S. Steelworkers blog, and he collaborates on the monthly Trade Justice Alliance newsletter. Hugh, you still with us?
Yes, thank you, Harriet.
You're welcome.
The first news item deals with the hard issues of the now current round of NAFTA talks. Among those mentioned in the article are an end date for NAFTA 2.0, allowing countries to opt out of the investor-state dispute settlement system, and to increase the requirement for when an item can be labeled Made in America. Also on the table during this round are government procurement and labor standards / wages. The second news link is to a 35-minute NPR podcast featuring two free traders, Sean Donnan, World Trade Editor for the Financial Times, and Mary Lovely of the Peterson Institute and Syracuse University, debating Michael Stumo, CEO of the Coalition for a Prosperous America. The third news bullet has Canada and Mexico teaming up for a better TPP 11 deal. Canada anticipating pressures from Japan and Australia, two countries wanting to move forward quickly to seal the 11-country deal, was joined by Mexico to obtain better terms on auto, cultural provisions, and the suspension of intellectual property provisions in the original TPP deal. The final news item has Steve Bannon sounding the alarm about areas relating to China that America's attention needs to be focused on, or we will be left behind in the wake of the communist country's wake. These areas include 1. The rollout of fifth-generation mobile technology known as 5G. 2. The expansion of the One Belt, One Road initiative, the transportation system through Central Asia to connect China and the Middle East. 3. Plan 2025, 10 industries that China have aimed to dominate by 2025. Bannon describes the Chinese as way ahead and said 3 of these industries are silicon chips, robotics, and artificial intelligence. 4, conversion of all oil transactions into Chinese currency, which Bannon said will end the U.S. dollar as a reserve currency and force us to start paying off the $20 trillion debt. 5, financial technology. Bannon said the true piece of leverage with North Korea is America's ability to decouple countries from the world financial system, sanction companies, and shut banks off from the capital markets. He predicts that in 5 to 10 years, that ability is gone. That's it.
Okay, thanks very much, Hugh. I wanted to mention also that next week we will be putting out our newsletter. So it's going to be probably a few days after the Thanksgiving weekend. So you'll be hearing more news after the Thanksgiving weekend. And now we'd like to open the lines up. If anyone has had a district meeting they would like to talk about, or they're planning a district meeting, press star 6 on your phone. We'd like to hear from you. So press star 6 and then a 1. All right. We've got Wendy Getz and Linda Brewster. Okay. We'll open Wendy's line first.
Thanks so much, Harriet.
Yep, go for it.
Josh Gottheimer, well, I just call him Goshheimer at this point in time. They ran a campaign against the previous congressman up here who, openly didn't like gay people, but we turned him and his fast-track vote, and he wasn't a very good person representing us, but they called it anybody but Garrett, so now we have to do anybody but Goshheimer. And he's a freshman Democrat who is completely with Wall Street. He did step up to the plate and fight with the taxes, and there's a lot of connecting the dots up here. We went on Friday morning. We had wallpapered his door with the freshman letter on Monday and sent letters and talked with him on Wednesday as well as Thursday. Our assemblymen and their chief of staff are trying to get meetings with us since June, along with the congressman. So we have a collaborative community effort, and lots of different groups involved, which is a nice bridging and encouraging. So our tactics, we have tried to be creative. We have stood with signs. We've decorated homes. We've incorporated holidays. We will continue to do as such, but we will try to.
Hello? I think we lost you, Wendy. You still there?
Yeah.
You're breaking up.
Okay.
Okay. You're
so
better now.
We'll continue moving forward and making it interesting for him. His staffers and folks there, he's a veteran affairs gentleman, took our call, gave us 31 minutes, almost 32 minutes, allowed us to speak on trade, would not give any answers, did not want any pictures, but he did give us time for other concerns. We have a campaign, we call it the Big Four Then, and I really appreciate William's presentation and his emphasis on, how a lot of these things connect. So we focus first on trade and the human rights involved in trade, health, environment, and net. So we call it the Big Four. Then we can have progress and equality and justice, then being the acronym trade, health, environment, and net. So we know that there are so many onslaughts, and how do we speak to them all at the same time and connect those dots? So, this circle of Big Four then, or circus, is more appropriate. So we're incorporating the Goshheimer and a few other unique instances. And I appreciate the time for the report back, and I appreciate all of the speakers this evening and yourself so much. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Wendy. So interesting. Yes. Thank you so much. Love to hear from you. Okay, next we've got Linda Brewster. Linda.
Hey, you guys.
Hey.
Yeah, I'm in Washington State. I was fortunate enough to get included with Sheldon Prentice of 350.org, who's an activist for the environment and, of course, a trade warrior. And we had got a meeting, actually, with Derek Kilmer, which I never could have gotten because he pretty much hates my guts. He's our Washington State representative in CD6. And we got him on the last tail end of a Friday afternoon for about half an hour. And as usual, he was charming but completely slippery. Mm-hmm. And he didn't make a commitment. We were making a presentation basically asking him to draw the line at ISDS, which, you'd think a Democrat would. Mm-hmm. But no, he's an economic development guy. He used to work with the Port of Tacoma, and he will never admit it, but he's a strong. And Washington is a strong trade supporter. We can't get our senators to support any kind of opposition to free trade and vote to kind of come down on the line with fair trade. Anyway, I've been gathering End ISDS postcards. I have a resolution in our local, pretty well known in the state, Jefferson County Democrats. I have a resolution to draw the line at ISDS. And I don't know that it'll make a great deal of difference, but I'm pretty sure it'll pass. It'll be on the 29th of this month. We'll be voting on it. It was read last month. We'll be voting on it this month, and then it will go directly to the Washington State Dems, where it'll, I think, be passed, but probably make no difference whatsoever. However, I'm willing to have another visit with Kilmer. I'm sure I won't get in to see him personally, to drop off the postcards I've gathered and probably to let him know about and his staff know about the Washington State Dems resolution when it does pass.
Oh, beautiful, beautiful. Well, it's always amazing to me that these people can't take a position on things that are no-brainers like this. We had a rough way to go with some of these Democrat freshmen in the state of Florida, waiting until the last minute to sign on. At least one of them did, to sign off on that freshman letter, and you just have to scratch your head and say, okay, he's a neoliberal,
Yep.
And it's rough. We just have to keep pushing and pushing. Mm-hmm. So thanks, Linda. That was really refreshing. And we'll talk to you again very soon, I'm sure.
I'm sure you will.
Great. Thank you. And now I just want to announce our December 10th webinar. We're kind of playing with the title. I put this together for the call, Global Resistance, Solidarity, and the Way Forward, the People's Trade Agenda. I'm sure Adam loves the length of that title. We always fight about how long our titles are going to be, but we're fortunate that we have Sharon Anglin Treat. She is the senior trade attorney with the Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy. We have spoken with a representative of Alianza Americas, and we will be having a speaker from their organization. We're not sure exactly who that is yet. And we will also have Anthony Vidal-Torres. He is Assistant Campaign Representative for the Sierra Club's Responsible Trade Program, who incidentally has been at the Paris talks. So he's out of the country at this moment, but he will be with us, and these three will speak on our December 10th webinar. And in Sharon Treat's few words, she says we will be discussing how the current corporate-driven agenda to limit food safety checks, speed up GMO and pesticide approvals, promote factory farms, and increase medicine costs is being negotiated behind closed doors on a speeded-up schedule, and that's all about NAFTA. So, how are we and the people of Canada and Mexico and the U.S. joining together to push for strong labor and environmental protections instead of the TPP plus agenda? So please join us for that. Okay, and I just wanted to remind everyone that you can access all of our past webinars by going to tradejustice.net/webinar-vids, VIDS. You will see all the YouTube videos put together by Carrie, our tech genius, who also happens to run the call board for us. And what she does is she takes these presentations and she mixes them with the audio and puts them on the YouTube. I don't know, some kind of magic thing. I have no idea how she does it, but she does a great job. And if you would like to join our Trade Justice Planning group, you can do it by calling the same number you called tonight. We don't have a presentation like this, but we have our conference call. And the same number that you called in tonight, 712-770-4160, and the PIN that you put in. And you can join our planning call. We need people to help us promote, I think, promotions for these webinars so we can promote all these amazing speakers that we get, and maybe some ideas for topics, and maybe some recruitment of speakers, and we could use some help. So we are a volunteer group, and last but not least, if you ever feel so inclined, you could help us cover our expenses by donating a little bit, like $5 here and there, at tradejustice.net/TJA donate. And last but not least, I would really like to thank everyone for joining us, and that includes the speakers and all of you for spending your Sunday evening with us. We know your time is valuable, and so that's why we really appreciate your willing to spend your Sunday evening with us. Thank you so much, and have a great evening.